A very good afternoon, good morning. I hope we are live, and there's a lot of you out there. A very warm welcome from me and Cristina Cafara to this event in two parts that brings together the perspective of privacy and data protection experts at the antitrust table together with competition regulators. So I want to give you a little sense for what is behind this event and how we got here. As a competition economist working in antitrust and digital markets, it has become increasingly clear to me, and I think others, that there's an essential data piece to wrestling with in these markets. There is a control of enormous amounts of personal data, which is what allows the key players in this market to protect their current power and indeed leverage it across market preempting competition. And these are certainly classic antitrust concerns, leveraging and preempting competition, but they also directly provide indeed enormous amounts of market power. And they've done so because they've given themselves the liberty to ignore the data protection rules. So there is really a two-way street here. There is a collection of vast amounts of data, which is made possible by the market power that allows to extract value and harm consumers. And at the same time, this is made possible by and facilitated by the flaunting of the rules to protect harms. But it gets even worse because we have data protection rules that we have in place, and not only they are systematically breached, certainly in Europe, by the tech giants with enormous firepower that they use today, and but they also have been spreading the propaganda that there is an irreconcilable difference or tension between the values of competition and data protection and their objectives. So the result of it is that we continue to operate in separate silos. There's the antitrust people doing market power over here, and the privacy and data protection people doing their own thing over there. But then when you talk to the data protection experts, the question that comes up quite often is, why don't the antitrust people really see what we see? So it's clear that the market power is supported by this internal data free-for-all, using data for different purposes, swinging the data that one owns without consent in ways that should be allowed. And they don't really see data protection as part of the solution, which is very little awareness of this, I think, in the antitrust world. And I want to say, finally, this is also true of economists. There is, with exception, a significant blind spot amongst economists working in this space, often also at the agencies, about how we need to integrate this perspective. So we have a standard theory, exclusion, leveraging, budget squeeze, and whatnot, but we don't really nail enough the way in which the data free-for-all allows the extraction and exploitation of market power that are direct consumer harms. So the purpose of this event is in some way threefold. One is to bring the privacy, the data protection experts to the antitrust. They have a lot to say on the harms and the potential solutions, and we need to listen. Two, argue that there should be integration of these perspectives. I hear often about intersection. You see, to me, intersection is I go this way, you go that way, and we meet in the middle, but very briefly and shallow. And that's not enough. And the third is that, particularly going to the contribution of the antitrust church and with the economists, that they need to wake up to this and start really listening. We cannot, as economists, continue to spout banality like, oh, data privacy is a dimension of quality. We do take it into account. That is so 2015. So this is why we decided to make this particular theme, this particular event, the launch event to this new competition research policy network that Greg Crawford and I set up under the umbrella of the CEPR. So before we just launch into the first panel, which is an amazing panel and a lot of things to say, I want to hand over to Greg Crawford, who is a professor at the University of Zurich, co-founder with me of this Research Policy Network Group, and certainly partner in crime, for a few words on RPN and its purposes. Greg.
Okay, thank you, Christina, very much, and a warm welcome from me as well to everyone joining us today. So as Christina mentioned, this is our kickoff event, our inaugural event for the CEPR Research and Policy Network on Competition Policy. So for those of you that aren't familiar, what is CEPR? CEPR stands for the Center for Economic Policy Research. And in my view, it has been sort of the leading research of academic economists in Europe over the last, say, 40 years, almost 40 years. And in the last little over a decade, CEPR has been investing in the policy part of CEPR. And it's done that in two ways. For some time, they've been hosting, many people don't know, VoxEU is the CEPR policy portal, and it's one of the leading web outlets for policy-related research and discussion, with something like 500,000 page views a month. But in the last couple of years, they've launched these new research and policy networks, what they call RPNs. And the goal of these is to specifically connect academics and policymakers. So there are now 9 RPNs with topics as diverse as populism, climate change, and now competition policy. So as Christina said, she and I have launched this new CEPR Competition Policy Network, and it's my pleasure because we both think we have complementary networks that are needed to, hopefully, to try to anyway, improve both competition policymaking and academic research related to competition policy worldwide. And so that segues to our first event. As Christina rightly pointed out, the topic of privacy and antitrust, I think, exemplifies this need to connect policymakers to academics. And that's really the goal. The goal of this endeavor that we've undertaken is to build bridges. It's to build bridges in principle to help policymakers understand the implications of the latest academic research, but even more, to be honest, it's more about sharing with academics the real concerns and issues that policymakers are facing on an everyday, concerns and issues that really would benefit from more academic input. So our hopes are high, and the interest that we've seen in this first event is encouraging. So we'll see what we can do with this endeavor. Last thing, before turning back to Christina to introduce our first panel, let me just briefly close with a comment about disclosures. So Christina and I both feel that disclosures are a necessity when commenting publicly about topics for everybody in competition policy. And so this CEPR Competition Policy Research Network has a strong disclosure policy, both for its members, their permanent members, as well as for anyone who participates as a speaker or speaks in any way in any of our events. So all the speakers on today's panel have disclosures on the CEPR competition policy website, and those people that are interested in that can go there. And with that, I will pass the baton back to Christina. I welcome you again. And Christina, take it away to introduce our first panel.
Thank you. So we're back, and the first panel is really about the question I posed at the beginning. What is it that the privacy and data protection experts see that the antitrust agencies are not seeing quite fully or in the same way? And my answer is that I think that there are a number of insights that are incredibly important that come from talking and understanding what data protection and privacy experts are saying, but they are not sufficiently integrated. So we keep sort of seeing these two as separate because practitioners, we haven't made that great progress in dealing with the market problem. We then send the data protection agencies out there to fight the data protection fight with plastic knives because they are not able to deal properly with what they are faced with, the enormous prevarication of market power that they're confronted with. And it is quite shocking to me that a number of agencies continue to quite unwilling to take this on board. So I come from the position today, this one in which the message is still this particular point. We should not confuse the insights. And we have an instrument for protection, we have an instrument for competition. We should just do things one at a time and trust. We don't even know if consumers care that much about price. I don't think that's an acceptable messaging. Let's see if we can make some progress with this topic in this discussion. I said there are exceptions. Fortunately, things have improved. We've seen, of course, the UK as a pioneering agency for this, the authority, and certainly a number of antitrust developments in the US. Certainly, there is more. But let me introduce the panel and just hand over to them for this discussion. Very briefly, I'm going to thank you for the bios, because that's fine, but just to name names. John Ryan, the fellow at the Irish Council, John is a real warrior in the space and a co-conspirator in some of these discussions. Ina Srinivasan, she has written seminal work on principles that have moved the dial enormously in this space. Again, she's a major force behind it. Claims against Google. This intent, this video, which which is a non-profit association managed to state content publishers and our voice in this discussion for some time. Of course, we're privileged to have Simon Thornton, director of the UK CMA, who's very involved and central to all of the work that the CMA is doing on digital, and will tell us about some super important developments in the last few weeks. And last but not least, Professor Alessandro Questi, Professor of Information Technology at Carnegie Mellon, and one of the very few economists to actually do relevant, important, and serious work in this space. So, dealt with disclosures, I have none particularly to make. I'm not doing paid work for anybody in this space, so let's move on to substance. Let me just kind of direct immediately to Johnny. So you, Johnny, have been, of course, leading multiple initiatives, including, although not immediately directed relevant to this particular discussion, a major lawsuit that you announced yesterday against all the major actors in real-time bidding. And you've been pushing this initiative to essentially progress GDPR enforcement and the need to pursue directly that enforcement in a way that helps us make progress also in antitrust. Start by telling us what it is that you see, that you think it is important for antitrust regulators to understand about the violation of data protection that you regularly see and need to be taken into account.
Thank you, Christina. And I want to start before I answer your question by applauding you for bringing us all together. I think this is important, and drawing everyone together so quickly, I think, is a tribute to the high regard in which we all hold you. What's in my mind at the outset of this conversation is that we have two crises. We have a privacy crisis and we have a market crisis, and the two are related. And in fact, I think they compound each other. 5 years ago, the final text of the GDPR was published. And I remember at that point I was working in industry, not in an NGO. And naively, I thought that the GDPR would constrain the big tech firms because it contains powerful tools to do so if only those tools were used. So I want to highlight 4 of those tools in particular to start this off. And I want to start with the most important one. First and most important is the purpose limitation principle. It's this old idea, it goes back to the 1970s, and it's enforceable in the GDPR on any firm. The purpose limitation principle prevents any firm from reusing data that it collected for one specific purpose for any other purposes, unless some fairly exacting requirements are met. So no internal sharing by default. It means that personal data must be tightly ring-fenced within a firm. And essentially, it's illegal to have an internal free-for-all of personal data. But as we know, big firms offensively leverage data from market to market. They combine and cross-use data not just between their subsidiaries, but also within subsidiaries across purposes. And this allows them to cascade their monopoly from market to market. But, and I think this is really important, it also makes them highly vulnerable to any enforcement of the purpose limitation principle. The purpose limitation principle is the unused, untouched kryptonite in the GDPR. And that's the thing I have felt for some time, that the competition community has not really thought about as hard as it should have. I'll run through the other three, though. Transparency of data processing. Vague terms such as "to improve our service" are often used, and we know that they are textbook examples of what you're not allowed to do. The third is special category data. These are defined in data protection law as data that could reveal your ethnicity, sexual orientation, religion, health, politics, anything interesting about you, Christina. They're supposed to be subject to special protections, and they can't be processed at all unless you get a particularly high standard of consent. And just to be clear, that consent would require the kind of disclosures that make it highly unlikely that it would be given. So if you're getting that kind of consent, you're probably not asking the right question. Much like, think of the Ba'ath Party and their 95% election victories consistently. The final one is the ease of withdrawal of consent. So by data protection law, it should be as easy to revoke consent as it was to give. And I'd like to see this idea tested. That might mean that if I prompt you 10 times to give consent, that should be matched by me reminding you 10 times you can revoke consent. So let me, summarize my answer by saying, if those four elements of data protection law were robustly enforced, it is difficult to imagine. Oh, that's my timer saying I'm over time. I didn't realize it was over.
Have another minute, don't worry.
Okay. If they were robustly enforced, it is very difficult to imagine that digital markets would appear as they currently do. They remain to be enforced. We still can. They are powerful tools, I think, to fix the market too. Not only would people's fundamental rights be upheld, but consumers would have the power to decide which parts of these businesses they want to reward with their data and for what use. It would be a big change.
So let me pursue this last point a little further, because you've described various ways in which the violations are taking place. And some people in the antitrust world can still look at you and say, but this is a failure of data protection, right? It is the data protection people who are not doing their job. What's it got to do with antitrust? Why are we implicated in this discussion? And why should we care? It's really a question of a different instrument. Why would it help us address the market power problem that we actually are tasked to address? We're not here to do consumer protection as such.
Yeah. I think there are two parts to an answer of that question. First, I said that these two crises compound each other. When the competition enforcers failed to stop the problem we have now in the market and allowed mergers to go through, that in retrospect, maybe they should have thought about a little bit harder. They made life harder for the data protection enforcers. Now, the data protection enforcers haven't covered themselves in glory either. There's plenty of blame. We can ladle it around on everyone, including me. I was in industry and I was stupid in my own way too. But when data protection enforcers and competition enforcers fail, they both create a bigger composite problem for themselves. So they need to work together. That's the first answer. And the answer is self-harm. The second part of the answer is, if you have powerful tools to free the consumer so that the consumer can decide not to be locked into everything that a huge conglomerate that is cascading across the market, destroying everything in its wake, is doing, surely you should allow the consumer that freedom to essentially regulate the market itself. And what I'm describing here is, you could think of it as a functional separation, a data separation, but essentially it's the absence of a default consolidation. So a consumer can decide which bit of which company it wants to do business with for what particular reason, without any default assumptions made by the business. It's the default assumptions made by the business that have ruined the market.
We'll come back to all of this, but I want to move over to the other side of the Atlantic and really talk to Jason about this. Because, Jason, you have a broad perspective. You worked for the digital publishing industry, but more generally, you have been a strong advocate for the way in which data protection violations are a manifestation of the market power problem. And at the outset, you were also had strong hopes that the GDPR in Europe could be a constrainer of power. It hasn't worked out that way. As Johnny says, there is faith going in various ways, and of course there is a concern that the data protection agencies have not done quite as much as they could, but at the same time that they're sent out there, as I said, fighting with plastic knives, because they are very, very much in a position to have to deal with power that we barely can. Now, give us your views on this whole discussion, and in particular, why the GDPR has failed. But we know in some sense that in the US it's fashionable on the part of the big tech operators to say that GDPR was bad law and was impossible to work. But give us the
I think I caught the end of that question, Christina. Thank you. First, I just want to echo, thank you for bringing us all together. Just amazing. Humbled to be with this group of people on such an important topic. So the question about my views on GDPR, yes, I speak for the publishers. We had high hopes for GDPR. I had high hopes. At that time, we'd advanced our thoughts well beyond kind of the industry lobbying that everything was working okay. We'd long agreed and talked about that the industry needed to better align with users' expectations for privacy. But we also knew there was this imbalance in the advertising market power because the duopoly, as we called it, had unique access to data on and importantly off their user-facing services. And that heightened privacy requirements could help rebalance the market power. That was our optimism. Our legal analysis of GDPR stated that two important things should happen, but admittedly they haven't yet. Echoing some of Johnny's thoughts. First, users would be able to make a simple choice not to be tracked outside of the websites and apps that they're actively choosing to use, and that this would force the companies to have to compete on the actual earned usage of their websites and apps, rather than on surveillance of users across the web and across their lives. Our research said that most users didn't want to be tracked. And second, even more consequential, GDPR's purpose limitations, which Johnny talked about, they would actually silo the data within the powerful platforms, neutralizing the ability to kind of tie together these dominant verticals. And so in 2017, we were on high alert. We were asking Google for quite some time to confirm that their advertising services would no longer have access to or own the data collected on publishers' sites. Just a month before GDPR rolled out, though, Google took a torpedo to this promise that we had for GDPR. And it easily leveraged its unique market power to ignore what was thousands of publishers' concerns. We brought together publishers around the world to express our concerns. Google asserted three things when GDPR rolled out. They said, we own all the audience data across the web, across the publishers. Wow. Amazing. Two, really unbelievably, and I thought quite arrogantly, Google said, take it or leave it. Publishers are required to get informed consent for what was really a not exhaustive list of Google's data processing. And three, probably most insulting to us, publishers were liable for Google's GDPR infringements downstream of that consent. So what happened as a result? Well, Google didn't miss a beat. And they continue to have access to almost all the same data with a bundled and broad consent requirement. All this data continues to get used for an endless set of purposes, services and brands in the Google empire. And how does this harm the consumer? That's what we care about most. Well, publishers miss out on that rebalancing of market power driven by data that was giving me high hopes. By Google saying we're going to have access to nearly all the data across the internet, it forced the bar for everyone else incredibly low in order to cobble together inferior and fairly unbridled data practices to try to compete with these dominant companies that have all the data. We have a market where violations of GDPR are now endemic to the market power players who are breaking the law. I'm still bullish at the direction of the competition authorities, but it's absolutely critical that they once and for all recognize that data protection must be integrated with the analysis, in the analysis of competition. An industry executive, just one last thing, an industry executive reminded me just a few weeks ago as to the merger review of Google's acquisition of market-leading ad tech company DoubleClick in 2007. Google stated, I looked this up, that we have no control over the advertising, no ownership of the data that comes with or is collected in the process of the advertising. That data is owned by the customers, publishers, and advertisers. And I quote, DoubleClick or Google cannot do anything with that data. So they broke the promise over and over, including when the most important data protection law on the globe was passed. So it sure seems like an antitrust problem at this point, and without integrating the two, we're not ever going to get the consumers back the trust that they should have. I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, so Jason, let me jump in.
Yeah.
So GDPR is not being enforced. What can antitrust do? So you and Johnny both talked about mergers that were approved that perhaps they shouldn't have been approved, but what about now? What can happen now and where? Sort of what jurisdiction, where around the world do you see things that might be done?
I see it happening, greatly on both sides of the oceans, and regulators, policymakers are learning from each other. We're seeing that certainly on the privacy and data protection side. So we have, California new privacy law mirroring a lot of the principles of GDPR. The CPRA is the California law. But we also see it on the rebalancing of power. The Digital Markets Act over in Europe, in some ways, it does the same thing as what we saw in the German cartel office decision against Facebook. And we even see in some of the U.S. House Congress's bills last week that were put out on Friday, they all seek to limit data protection and collection and use across dominant services. So it neutralizes those dominant companies from their gatekeeper status. So if they have a gatekeeper quality and, there's no way to avoid using, let's say, Gmail or avoid using Facebook to keep up with what's going on at school, then they can't use that status as a gatekeeper in order to leverage and collect data across their entire services. It really does neutralizes them.
Okay, so I think we'll come back to this as well, but let me then transition to Dina. So Dina, let me go a little broader than in the question just now to Jason. So how should we think about sort of data dominance in general from an antitrust perspective, right? So we know you've been involved with the Texas State AG's complaint. Your early writings have underlined the theories of harm that have been used in the Facebook complaints. So drawing from this experience, can you give us a view of what you saw and maybe even continue to see, both how the exploitation of data can lead to antitrust harms, both in general and then drawing on maybe some of the examples that you're familiar with from your experience?
Sure. Thanks, Greg, and thanks for having me. I think that at least when it comes to the first question, we shouldn't even be having this conversation about whether there's an intersection between competition and data. And let me tell you why. And I don't think we should even be talking about whether they should be integrated. I think that data rules should always fall under a subset of competition conversations. So let me give a few examples in other markets that we've dealt with throughout history and that we're dealing with today, and how we really should all agree on this broad principle. In financial markets in the US, in Europe, across the world, over 160 countries agree that the centralized electronic marketplaces where you buy and sell stock should give all buyers on their platform, brokers on their platform, fair access to data, because data is critical when buying and selling on those platforms. When the first electronic marketplaces for airlines emerged, the airline marketplaces, the GDSs, now called CRSs, the computer reservation systems, also started to engage in this practice of giving some players better data and other players a little bit worse data. And again, we saw this as a competition problem. It was creating all kinds of distortions in the market. In the US, in Europe, in the UK, we regulated these practices and required the platforms to give different parties on the platform fair access to data. Just last month in the US, we had Chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission, Chairman Gensler, say that we're seeing similar problems now on crypto exchanges and in crypto markets, and we should consider similarly regulating these centralized venues where crypto is being bought and sold. I'll also point to a fourth example, which is the ticketing market. We have centralized marketplaces where tickets for theater, sporting events, music events are bought and sold. Again, fair access to data is critical to protecting competition. So today we're talking about the largest platforms, some of the largest platforms in the world. They're new markets, so they look a little bit different. But again, all that's happening is the buying and selling of ads on these centralized electronic platforms, which today we call ad exchanges. These are real-time auctions, whether we're talking about Facebook revenues or whether we're talking about Google revenues. And access to data is critical to competition. So that's one of the things that's going on. Another thing that's going on in these digital markets, in these digital advertising markets, when it comes to Facebook and Google, is that the structure of the market is structured such that you don't just have platforms, you also have brokers that are representing buyers and sellers. And Johnny calls it data free for all, right? Jason references Google's historic promise to act as a broker on behalf of publishers and, to not use that data for other purposes. In other markets like financial markets, we would understand the competition harm because we would say, oh, of course, the data in the broker division should be sectioned and walled off from the exchange division. And, we call data mergers or data free-for-alls, and trading on that data, we give them specific names like insider trading, right? So I don't think we have to get too crazy to understand the intersection between data, privacy, and competition. I think we have lots of other markets that we can look to, and we have structured thinking to understand what's going on with respect to Google and Facebook, what's going on in the electronically traded advertising market, and how exactly that intersects with competition concerns.
Let me pursue you a little bit on this, Dina. I know that you have been making multiple times this case that there are these other kind of examples out there, and I think it's a powerful point. These are industries in which it is taken for read that we need to regulate and we need to do something because the inherent conflicts of interest are clear, and we need to do it. On the other hand, what I think is the case. The call that we're making here, which I think you are certainly someone who represents this in a great way, is that we are where we are when it comes to personal data and the way in which it shores up the market power. And when you look at antitrust cases, and when you look at conducts and mergers, time after time, you see that in the main, it's beginning to change, but the recent experience remains that competition agencies fashion theories of harm that are conventional, because that's what we know. We know how to do leverage, and we know how to do foreclosure in a conventional way. We know how to do margin squeeze. And so the call here is, in fact, something which is embodied in the work that you've done for Texas and others, to really explain and make clear how the theories of harm in an antitrust case can proceed from an understanding of the way in which the data piece actually generates that market power and enables that conduct that is at issue. It isn't so self-evident, because in case after case, my experience is that we look at something and we say, oh, sort of conventional stuff. So we don't have exploitation. We don't really do exploitation. We just kind of, at least in Europe, we just do very little of it. So this is really the point that I want to push. Do you have a reaction to that?
So I think, Christina, are you asking for like a concrete example of how it's playing out in one of the?
Yeah. Why don't you do that? That's powerful.
Sure. Okay. So, and I'll just go back to really the example that Jason gave, right? So in advertising, we have an electronically traded market with exchanges, and we have brokers on both sides. In a competitive market, when competition was working, you saw that those brokers were acting in the best interests of buyers and sellers. And as part of carrying out that function, they were sort of protecting the data that belonged to buyers and sellers in that market, and not playing with the data in other ways, not trading on it, not doing conduct similar to insider trading or even front running, right? So Google acquired DoubleClick, made promises to continue operating in that manner. The promises were not binding and on the record. You know, the enforcement agencies or the agencies that cleared the mergers didn't sort of make Google promise that they would abide by that moving forward. And so as Google gained market power in that market, they can just, you know, there's no regulatory requirement to continue to act in the best interest of your clients. So now it becomes a market power issue. And after they gain enough market power, they can flip data ownership and say, okay, you know what? Before you owned this data and we weren't allowed to do anything with it, but now we're going to use that data to, for example, sell our own advertising on exchanges. But what we know from other markets and from financial markets is when you flip data ownership and you engage in conduct like that, that allows the firm to now build market power in yet another market. So this is an example of both of these things going on. On the one hand, sort of data ownership or assignment problem happening as a result of market power, and then that switch in assignment leading to market power in another market.
Great, and we'll get back to this. I think it's an excellent example, and indeed it is well laid out in the Texas complaint. I want to actually now move on to a regulator. We are fortunate to have in this panel a regulator and someone actually I have a lot of time for from an agency which is entirely pioneering in this space. The CMA, I think, distinguishes itself globally with very few others for having really been at the forefront of the thinking on this. So, of course, Simeon Thornton, Simeon, you have been involved throughout, really, the work of the CMA on digital markets, the study, which has been very influential. But what I would like you to do more than anything right now is really give us a bit of an update. There's been a significant development in the last few days. Again, you're very involved in this. The CMA has been known to be investigating the Google Privacy Sandbox, a development which has created a lot of talk around the world about the implications of this apparent effort to just respond to call for perhaps more privacy compliance, but very questionable. So the important thing is that the CMA, of course, has pursued this investigation for some time, and just now, at the end of last week, you've announced that you are consulting on undertakings. So you must be persuaded that there is potentially a way forward, although you're consulting, and of course you're gathering views from parties. But what is it that you can tell us about your thinking in coming to these undertakings? And do you think ultimately that this is something that has the potential to be successful? After all, we heard about failed previous attempts and broken promises.
Thanks, Christina. I'll do my best to live up to your billing. Perhaps if I just give a brief bit of context, first of all, on what we're doing in relation to Privacy Sandbox, and then I'll come to your challenge about whether these commitments will be effective. The Privacy Sandbox is Google's name for a set of proposals to remove third-party cookies from the Chrome browser. And replace them with a set of tools that are intended to be less privacy invasive. There are real privacy concerns about the use of third-party cookies, but they are also currently fundamental building blocks in the way that digital advertising markets work. And the CMA identified three main problems about the proposals. The first, to echo, I think, some of Jason's comments, there's a concern that they could distort competition in digital advertising markets by restricting valuable functionality for third parties while retaining this functionality for Google. Second, there's a concern that the proposals could be used to self-preference Google's own digital advertising services by transferring key functionalities to Chrome and allowing Google to affect market outcomes in a way that can't be scrutinized by third parties. And third, the concern is that the proposals could effectively deny Chrome users substantial choice in terms of whether and how their personal data is used for targeting and delivering advertising to them. As you say, we've now secured commitments from Google to address our concerns, essentially by involving the CMA in the future development of the proposals. And we are currently consulting on whether to accept them. And I wanted to make two points. First, directly relevant to the conversation today, I think data protection and respecting users' rights to privacy are very much at the heart of the commitments on which we are currently consulting. Indeed, they are baked into them. If we accept the commitments, Google will be required to develop the proposals according to a number of criteria, including impacts on privacy outcomes and compliance with data protection principles, and impacts on user experience and user control over the use of their personal data, alongside the overriding objective of the commitments, which is to address our competition concerns. We have worked closely with the ICO in seeking to understand the proposals, and if we do accept the commitments, then we will continue to work closely with the ICO in influencing the future development of those proposals. In terms of your challenge, your fair challenge about the credibility of the commitments and how effective they'll be, I think I'd make 3 points. The first is just to observe these commitments, if we accept them, are legally binding and enforceable through a court of law, so they become mandatory once accepted. Secondly, we have designed the commitments around principles. For example, the requirement on Google to avoid distortions to competition, including through self-preferencing, rather than using very prescriptive and specific rules. And we did this to avoid the potential for loopholes or gaming, and to avoid the risk that the rules become redundant through technological change. Third, and this may be a point of differentiation with previous examples. If we accept the commitments, that's not the end of the CMA's work. On the contrary, that's when, in many respects, the real work begins. Under the commitments, the CMA will be closely involved in the development, implementation, and monitoring of the proposals, including through the design of trials, for example. It's a substantial investment from the CMA, and we will be dedicating the right people, including data scientists, for example, to the job. And the final point I wanted to make, perhaps the most important one, is that the commitments include provisions to ensure that Google addresses any concerns that the CMA has. And if outstanding concerns cannot be resolved with Google, they explicitly provide for the CMA to reopen the case and, if necessary, impose any interim measures necessary to avoid harm to competition. So there's no doubt this is a big undertaking, and it's going to be challenging for the CMA, I'm sure of that. But personally, I think this is the sort of approach that is required if we are really to tackle the concerns we're seeing in digital markets today. I think as regulators, we do need to step up. We need to get involved before the harm materializes, rather than waiting after the event to stop it from materializing, rather than waiting until that harm is irrevocable. So I think it's a big move and it's a challenging one. But personally, I think it's potentially a sign of the future direction of travel in a number of these sorts of cases.
Well, let me ask you a couple of follow-ups, and then I think that at the end we'll go around again, because everyone is I'm sure in this panel and outside super interested in what this looks like and what this means. So the reason this is so important is, of course, that you are a national regulator, but the expectation is that whatever is being agreed with you will tend to become the norm for this particular practice for Google outside of the UK. So it will have the potential to become a global standard for the sandbox, and so that's why there's so much attention to it. And then you describe the approach, which you outline as being to set some general principles that need to be met or abided by, rather than being too prescriptive. But of course, I completely see that you're always into a trade-off there. Whichever thing you do, if you're too prescriptive, you create a roadmap for loopholes. We have good, colorful expressions in Italian for that thing precisely. At the same time, if you are quite principled in general, there is also the question of, well, how binding is this going to be? Because, of course, my experience of working with companies is that if you're just general, take compliance, play dead. I'm just actually doing exactly what I'm supposed to do. Do you have a problem? So I think it would be I'm sure we'll go back again on this, but to think about the important trade-offs here is, I'm sure, something you've considered very carefully, but I'd like you to pursue this a little bit.
Yes, that's perfectly fair enough. On the first point, yes, I mean, Google, when we launched the consultation on the commitments, Google did state its intention to continue to operate Chrome as a global product, the implication of which is that, the commitments would be driving that global change. And we have certainly been very keen to engage internationally with our sister competition authorities in different parts of the world, and ICO with other DPAs as well. So we are certainly aware of how big these changes are. On the question of principles versus rules, I think certainly I would share your concerns if we simply articulated some principles and then say, well, that's the commitments, goodbye, we're going on to a new case. But we're not. These principles are going to be driving the decision making, and they underpin some very hard-edged quantitative data. So, for example, one criterion that will be relevant for considering the adequacy of these tools is, do they provide publishers with adequate ability to generate revenue? That is the sort of thing that can be tested quantitatively through RCTs and trials of the sort that are envisaged through this process. So it's a principle, but it drives hard-edged decision-making. So I think that's the point I'd make. The other point is that alongside these principles, there are some specific commitments from Google not to combine certain data sources for the purposes of user tracking. Now, the commitments go into those. I think what we have said is we think that this is helpful, but there may well be a need for further developments through the development of the proposal. So those principles are guiding principles. They give us a framework within which to operate. but they underpin the work that we will be doing through the development of the proposals over the next few months.
Okay. So thank you, Simeon. So I think, as Christina said, I think we'll let everyone have a turn to come back. So I'm sure there will be further on this topic. But let me shift gears slightly. So I'm coming to Alessandro. So we've heard about a number of failures of GDPR and related privacy regulations that clearly have had an impact on the development of the online advertising market, especially as Johnny was saying, this failure to enforce purpose limitations, but also others, this maybe lack of transparency of what data is collected and how it's used. So let me add one more to that bucket, because it's coming to a theme that hasn't been discussed as much yet by the panelists. So motivated in part by the Google Fitbit merger clearance in the EU, at least for Christina and me. Christina, Johnny, and I have recently written a piece on VoxEU, arguing that the framing of the antitrust consequences of the lack of data protection is just a little bit off. So from our view, based on that experience, agency economists seem to treat it only as a quality characteristic of the platform. And that, from an economic theory perspective, is not so useful because quality can go up or down in the presence of market power. But our view, or at least mine, I should speak only for myself, my view is the primary way that consumers pay for many of these digital services is with their data. And so shouldn't it be better just to treat it as a price and think of it as when market power goes up, consumers, we've seen this pattern in the development of these markets, consumers are required to give more data, and we should think of that as the price that they're paying for access. So Alessandro, so you are one of the leading academics analyzing the economics of privacy. You have this privacy economics experiments lab at Carnegie Mellon, exploring questions like this. So let me pose sort of 3 questions to you, and you can sort of shift between how you want to answer them. So consider this idea of privacy as a price, as well as some of the digital platform conduct, especially the failing to respect purpose limitations that we've heard from the other panelists. Which of these do you think could be measured, the harm? Which of, if we think about consumer harm from these practices, which of these might be measured? 2, how would you measure them? Maybe. And 3, what would you think you might find in light of existing research, including your own, on the privacy paradox? So I'll pass it back to you.
Sure, thank you. So trying to tackle that step by step, the lack of consent, we can measure that to some extent, and we do. We have a host of behavioral studies over the years that capture the degree to which information asymmetries or cognitive and behavioral biases can affect consumer consent, and how platforms can take advantage of that to promote or nudge engagement or disclosure. It has become popular to refer to all of that as dark partners nowadays, but really the research from behavior economists in this space dates back to even 2005 and onwards. We even had a review in Science, the scientific journal on this. Privacy as price, we can measure that, but unfortunately, I would argue we don't, or not enough to know whether the price that consumers are paying through their data is fair and commensurate to the services and benefits they're getting back. Meaning that the notion that we pay for services with data has by now entered the mainstream, no doubt. Unfortunately, the value proposition for consumers remain opaque. If you look at behavioral advertising, the advertising industry frames it as an economic win-win, where every stakeholder benefits, publishers, merchants, consumers, by virtue of the reduction in search costs that data allows. But in fact, and this is to me is quite remarkable, perhaps even ironic, while the surplus that large data platforms are enjoying from data is visible to anyone, there is much less clarity and lack of information about the benefits for the other stakeholders, how they're doing. There is plenty of academic and industry research on click-through rates and conversion rates for merchants, advertisers. We do know that they go up significantly with behavioral targeting. There is no doubt about that. But it's more nuanced to the discussion of what are the ultimate downstream implications of this. We know, in fact, that merchants, in presence of targeted advertising, enter some form of zero-sum game. Each merchant or firm must engage in targeting if it's competitors do, simply to keep the consumer. So essentially, everyone moves back to some kind of prisoner dilemma equilibrium where they keep their customers, but they are paying more for them. We have much less evidence, much less empirical evidence on other stakeholders, such as publishers, the benefits they accrue from targeted advertising. Our own studies based on publisher level data suggest a much smaller benefit than what found in other studies done with platform data. And we know, and this may sound a bold claim, but I stand by it, we know close to nothing about the consumer benefit. What do I mean by this? We know that search costs go down. Because this is shown implicitly by increasing click-through rate in presence of targeted ads. But a reduction of search costs is just one element of the utility function of a consumer. Other elements, such as prices and quality of goods, quality of vendors, may change when a consumer clicks and buys from an ad versus search for a product, looks at the organic search results and buys from there. And we really don't have any study that captures that comparatively, and therefore we really cannot say anything yet of conclusive about consumer welfare. And finally, the last example you posited was, okay, what about the harms of this data composition? Well, this is to me perhaps the most interesting and perplexing issue in this field. Because there is a conceptual problem, I believe, that we face. And it makes it probably hard for IO economists to properly define privacy consumer harm. And this is the problem, that there is not a single form of harm. There is a vast array of harms, different types. If you go back to the literature on the economics of privacy to the mid-1990s up to maybe 2010, most of us, including myself, who were working on modeling, so theoretical model of economics of privacy, were focusing on harm in terms of price discrimination. Essentially, in our models, we would assume that consumer reservation price is private information. If the merchant acquires the private information, can discriminate, price discriminate the consumer and extract surplus, and that's harm. And many models focus on that. But in fact, nothing bad with that, but that's just one single arm of many that are possible, from identity theft to spam to non-price discrimination, including hiring discrimination, physical harm, reputational harm, emotional harm, chilling effects harm, control harm, data quality harms, and so forth. Now, to even example why it's difficult to aggregate into a single function or estimate together these harms, I am going to choose two opposite examples, the opposite ends of the spectrum. Consider on one end transaction costs associated with online trackers. Basically, every time you go to a website, there are trackers which are being loaded by your browser. They slow down a little bit the loading of the actual content of the page for you. Now, at the individual level and at the website level, that cost is negligible. You don't even notice it. But when you start aggregating all the sites the consumer visits and all the consumers visiting of sites, you start realizing that there is this large societal opportunity cost of time wasted. On the opposite side of the spectrum, consider the report that Facebook itself had to commission on its role in fomenting genocidal violence in Myanmar, due to how data-driven personalization algorithms help spread incendiary posts. So you have basically two completely different examples. One is an example of something happens every single time you go online, high frequency, high probability, very small cost, and very directly related to data collection. On the opposite hand, you have a catastrophic cost, very low frequency, very low probability, and 2 to 3 degrees removed from actual data collection. And the problem is that all of these are privacy harm. But it's very difficult for us as modelers and also empirically speaking to aggregate them into a single function. So the problem is not there is no harm, is that there are too many different types of harm and it becomes difficult. That's how I explain myself why economists don't see the harm, because they cannot find a way to connect all these harms together.
So let me pick up on this, because I think fabulous example. And fabulous point, right? So there's lots of potential harms. And so then that says to me, with all these potential harms, it makes it even more surprising that competition authorities don't pick this up as a topic in either merger or conduct cases as something to just be explored, right? And so let's go to some of your harms, because I want to follow up a little bit on so you said there aren't good estimates. So hopefully, I think there are many young IO economists or empirical economists listening to this panel right now, and you're an expert in measuring consumer harm. So pick one or two, you don't even have to name them, but what would you advise to an empirical researcher that was interested in this topic that says, okay, yeah, there's something missing in the economics literature, I want to solve that? How would you advise to them to go ahead and do that?
I personally would start from the lower hanging fruit, which is understanding the benefits or lack thereof of behavioral targeting for consumers. Once again, the argument I made earlier that yes, we know the search costs go down, but that is presented as a unalloyed benefit that trumps everything else. But again, we really don't know. We don't have a good comparative analysis of changes in prices, changes in quality of products, changes in quality of vendors, and that's truly surprising, considering how important online behavioral advertising has become. I would also urge my colleague economists to revisit the misconception that consumers do not have a demand for privacy. And here, in a way, I'm getting to, I believe that was the second part of your question, right? This privacy paradox story. So this is also quite surprising. I call it the paradox of the privacy paradox, is that we have plenty of evidence of consumer demand for privacy. We have anecdotal evidence that people engage in privacy protected behaviors instinctively and all the time. On Zoom, many of us alternate between opening and closing our microphone, opening and closing our video, depending on how much we want to show our background, our environment to others. Well, that's a privacy behavior, right? We don't even think about that as a privacy behavior because it comes so instinctual. But in fact, we engage in this behavior continuously. And by the way, the evidence is not just anecdotal. We have survey evidence, for instance, and I'm citing one out of many, PW 2014, finding that 86% of the Americans, adults they had surveyed, they take some step to protect their privacy, from the simple ones such as removing cookies to the sophisticated ones such as using virtual private networks. We have, if you don't believe self-reported surveys, and I don't blame you if you don't, as an economist, we have observational studies. When you may recall when the I don't remember whether it was the FTC. I think it was the ATC when they opened up the National Do Not Call Registry. Mm-hmm. Within a short span of time, over 70% of Americans had joined because they didn't want to be called during their dinner. Or our own studies showing how Facebook users in the Carnegie Mellon network, when it started in 2005, close to when it started in 2005. 86% were publicly sharing even personal data like birthday. By 2009, if I recall correctly, so just 4 years later, that percentage had dropped to 22%. So people realized how much they were disclosing and they decreased their disclosure. So essentially, I could go on and on, but there's plenty of evidence of the demand for privacy. There is evidence, of course, also of information-seeking, disclosure-seeking behavior and behaviors, evidence of behaviors that seemingly may be considered as disregarding privacy. But here is the key, and if I can conclude on this, the evidence of this disclosure-seeking behavior cannot be seen, it cannot be used as an argument against the evidence that people also at the same time seek privacy. So if you go back at the early days of the economics of privacy, which started really with giant Chicago school scholars such as Posner and Stigler, their contributions were seminal. So what I'm about to say is not meant to be a diss at them, but they construed privacy solely as protection of information. This monolithic view of privacy as just shielding, hiding, protecting. That is not how modern scholarship of privacy looks at privacy. Modern scholarship looks at privacy as a dynamic process of opening and sharing. If I meet you for drinks over dinner and I share a secret with you, but I'm not posting on Facebook, I am engaging privacy management behavior. If you then share my secret with others, then you are violating my privacy. So the point being that the error that some of us make is that by looking at evidence of disclosure-seeking behavior, of which there is plenty, some of us end up concluding that people don't care for privacy. In fact, we should look both at the disclosure behavior and the protective behavior as evidence that people tend and try all the time to manage these boundaries. But of course, for the reasons that my colleague panelists formulated very nicely, it is very difficult for us to reach this desired balance between protecting and sharing when we have not just behavioral hurdles, but economic hurdles, oligopolies, market power, which dictate the extent to which we can exercise this desired balance between protecting and sharing.
Okay. Cristina, do you want to take over?
Yes, yeah. I want to take it forward. Alessandro, this was fab, and it's so important that you say what you just said to the audience, because it is essential to really nail this notion that consumers do care about privacy. We cannot question that in 2021. I still hear people saying there isn't clear evidence that consumers care about privacy. I think that is a debate that really needs to end. Moreover, for the purpose of the economic analysis of some of this conduct, which is what ultimately we want to pursue, it's clear what you say, that there are multiple harms. It's difficult to congeal them in a single measure, in a single parameter, but this work needs to proceed, because the alternative is that we continue with this old check that privacy is a dimension of quality from which nothing follows. Okay? No useful insight follows from that for a practical case. But let me go back to do another tour of our speakers, because we heard so much already, and I am sure that each of them has got reactions and thoughts about what came after them or before. So, Johnny, let me start with you. It was interesting to watch this sort of the body language of you and Jason and Dina while Simeon was speaking. And I want to give you the opportunity to react in any way you like to what you heard after you set out your stall. Pick any topic and take it up.
Oh, okay. First, let me pick up on this idea of the paradox, of the privacy paradox. If this panel is about applying the data protection lens, none of that matters. Doesn't matter at all. It might matter for the next panel, and it's great Alessandro raised it, but data protection is a fundamental right. Doesn't matter whether people care about it. So if you're thinking about this through a data protection lens, it doesn't matter whether there's a paradox. It turns out if you're thinking about it only from a market lens, it does matter, and the other side's argument may have been wrong all along. But actually, that doesn't matter in data protection terms. I want to raise something that has popped up tangentially in the conversation, and that is mergers, acquisitions. DoubleClick came up. And I want to bring a data protection idea and drop it in the middle of competition problems. I suspect that when a competition authority is considering whether to permit a merger or an acquisition, where company B is hoping to gain the use of data held by company A, they probably have a very sophisticated analysis with at least two axes, something like, is this data high quality and really great data. Of course, they want to get it. And the second axis, in addition to quality, is quantity. Will they be getting loads of data? So, for example, will they be getting health data about 2 million people or 4 million people? And what kind of data will it be? That's fine. But it's missing a third axis, something that makes it three-dimensional. The data protection additional question, or one of them is, will the acquiring company be allowed to use company A's data for the reasons it wants to use them for? So it's not just about quantity, and it's not just about quality. It's also about availability or applicability, right? Are you legally allowed to use the data for those purposes? I suspect if one applied that third axis or variable to an awful lot of acquisitions that have happened, you'd be scratching your head thinking, well, this company has no lawful way of using these data. Once it buys the target company, we better ask it, what's the deal with that? And why are you paying so much? So that's the kind of added tier maybe of analysis that hopefully it's present, but I suspect it isn't, that data protection and competition can bring to each other. I'll shut up.
No.
Jason, you next.
I guess simply put, you want me to react to what I heard from Simeon, which, after reading what was put out last week, what I heard and I hear from the CMA, that's music to my ears. I mean, it's very positive, especially if it's legally binding, those commitments from Google. I guess and it's principle based. I love it. I guess my question is, when I read the commitments, I saw things like, and it gave me nightmares back to the GDPR story I shared. I saw things like Google committing to, not try to take controller status or ownership over analytics, Google Analytics, but I didn't see that for Google Ad Manager. And so it gets into this kind of prescriptive commitment that we end up playing whack-a-mole, and I don't understand why it's not just principle based and why that principle isn't just Google can't be controller over publishers' data, period. Why don't we just double down on that? They should not play that side of the market. If that's done at principle based and legally binding, to Johnny's point, then hallelujah, let's get there.
Dina, you were also smiling and interestingly listening to what Simeon was saying. I'll give the floor to Simeon again, but would you like to react to what you've heard so far?
I'll just make a general comment, which is, again, when we look at our experience in other markets, and how we've had to regulate data in other markets, it rarely works if we allow a company to have underlying conflicts of interest and we simply pass rules and make them promise to abide by it. Breaches are really easy to do behind the scenes and to not get caught using data or merging data. Data is very amorphous, it's invisible. In financial markets, we had rules that said if you're operating on the buy side or the sell side and you're operating an exchange, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't merge data in this way, you can't use it in that way. But what did we learn from those markets? We learned that those even rules don't work when a firm has conflicts of interest and you develop rules. That's not enough. In the US and elsewhere, but in the US, Congress passed additional rules that said, okay, you know what? We need actually firewalls between divisions. There's two approaches that are going to work here. A, you can't operate on different sides of the market at the same time, so divest assets that have conflicts of interest. And the second approach is to achieve sort of the same things, try to achieve structural separation without structural separation. That means ethical walls between divisions, firewalls between different divisions, decouple employees, compensation plans need to be not adversely sort of incentivized. I'll give one other example one other example here. In testimony last year, and we with Amazon and Bezos, and we also had breaking news, I think, in the Wall Street Journal about how Amazon was using third parties' data to develop its own products. And Bezos testified that Amazon had a rule against this, and that employees were not supposed to be doing that, and that it was not happening on, at Amazon. And then later we discovered via breaking news that in fact it was happening with Amazon, and we should know, again, from our experience in financial markets, that this is expected and this will happen. If you sit employees right next to the other employees that have the data, and if the first group of employees is incentivized to use the data because their compensation plans, are driven by increased sales, then that's just naturally going to happen. It's just too easy. It's going to happen. And you need to have structural separations to get to the heart of the problem.
Thank you. And Simeon, you've heard a few reactions to your laying out the proposal. Anything you want to add to what you heard?
A lot of really interesting thoughts. I did actually want to just reflect on one thing that Johnny said to begin with about the importance of purpose limitation. And it reminds me of Andrea in the next session is going to be talking about the joint statement that we produced with the ICO on the interaction between competition and data protection. And I think our headline finding from that is we think there are strong synergies between competition and data protection, contrary to some of the characterizations that we sometimes hear. I think, one way of characterizing these concerns is increasingly in data protection and other realms, we see situations in which large online platforms are playing quasi-regulatory roles. So they're interpreting the provisions of data protection, not just for themselves, but for third parties, and obviously have a conflict in doing so since they're a commercially interested party. And in that joint statement with the ICO, we set out a kind of straw man view of data protection in which transfers of data within a single owned company are fine, but transfers between separately owned companies, even if they're functionally equivalent, are problematic. And I think we made the point, and it kind of brings a lot of these thoughts together, that interpretation is not just problematic from a competition perspective. It would create big incentives for integration and future mergers. It's also highly problematic from a data protection perspective because it transgresses just the kind of purpose limitation principles that Johnny mentioned, but also the other important principles in GDPR about fairness and transparency. It requires an understanding on the part of users of corporate governance and ownership that stretches credulity. So I just wanted to end with that, really, that sometimes these two agendas are seen as in opposition. We absolutely do not subscribe to that. And we think that, in the vast majority of cases, strong implementation of data protection regulation and competition are entirely synergistic.
This is such an important point, and it is the very motivation for this whole event. Indeed, as you say, we will move on in part 2 to discuss the joint statement that you issued with the data protection regulator in the UK, which is really important because it highlights those synergies rather than the conventional view that there is a conflict. One or two questions in the chat have picked up on that conflict, and there is a conventional or perhaps a widespread rather than conventional view that there is in fact a conflict between the perception of data protection or the goals of data protection and those of competition, because if you allow, for example, for data to be shared, well, for competition purposes, isn't that going to actually be in contrast with the objective of privacy? So I think that notion that there is a tension between the two is one that you rightly pointed out needs to be overcome. There are more synergies than conflicts. But I want to give Jason, who was happy with what he was saying, the opportunity to say one final thing on this before we back to wrap it up and perhaps Alessandro for his finals.
Yeah, I just was excited to hear the term purpose limitations out of a competition authority. So, I just echo that, by forcing the dominant gatekeepers to play by the actual rules and not just be able to design and determine which ones they want to play by, that will raise the bar across the entire industry, and that privacy is actually eroded, including across publishers, because antitrust isn't being enforced to make sure the largest players are following those rules. So it's actually ironic that, you know, publishers actually want higher trust, higher consumer, higher direct trusted relationships with the users, but they're having to lower the bar in order to compete with these giants that get to determine the rules. So again, let's go. I love it.
So let me just try and conclude. We're almost at time, but I wanted to give a final word to Johnny as a fellow mischief maker, because much of what he thinks about this has influenced the way I see it. So something that Johnny has really sort of convinced me of is that really when he talks about data free for all, there is this external data free for all, this world of toxic ecosystem of data users that is not what we're talking about here. It's the internal data free for all, the notion that data is being effectively used across purposes without constraints, which is at the heart of GDPR rules. That is actually what matters when you think it's in competition, because that supports the market power and allows you to extend that market power. Johnny, do you want to just wrap up with a final comment on this? And I try to
Yes, thank you, Christina. It's actually hard to wrap up because we seem to be coming into alignment. So all the foregoing ... And it's quite amazing that we've got here. But it's a terrible shame that it's taken 3 years, and you could go further. I remember 5 years ago, you know, when we had the final text of the GDPR, the big question in industry is Europe serious about this thing, or is it going to be another, you know, damp squib? Everyone on the other side of the Atlantic and on this one in industry was asking that question. And what Europe said was, yes, we are serious. This is one of the jewels in our crown. We really mean it. That has turned out not to be the case. And there's a problem that I think needs to be resolved, not just at national level, but at the Commission. You know, we have this enforcement gap that we need to fix. But actually, Christina, I think there's a problem at the level of DG Just as well as DG Comp. They together need to fix that problem too. We need to see pressure on governments across the union. I'm not picking on any one or two. I think everyone.
Are you good?
Well, I have elsewhere, so I won't hear. But
yes.
It is great to see the competition authorities stepping up here. And there is a compounding problem that each causes the other. But it does feel today that the balance of harm falls on the competition authorities, that they are having to investigate areas that actually were not necessarily their own. And now, luckily, they're making it their own, which is very positive.
Which is what this conversation is about. And we are precisely on time. It's 4:20 London time. I think we have had a great discussion. I'm enormously grateful to all of the speakers. I think that they said incredibly interesting things. We will now take a deserved 10 minutes break for making coffee, and then we will come back. Johnny and I will moderate the next panel, which is going to be trying to put some of this perspective directly to the main actors in the competition arena. So please stay with us. Come back in 10 minutes. And in the meantime, to all the speakers, great job and thank each of you. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.